Do you know that in 1933, there were about 500,000 Jews living in Germany? April 1st, 1933 was when the boycott on Jewish businesses started. The Nazis came into, Hitler's henchmen came into Jewish businesses, ransacked them, prevented people from coming into the businesses, and started wreaking havoc on the Jews' ability to do business. May 10th, there was a public burning of books. This all happening in 1933, and the violence really started before Hitler was even in power. It began earlier. They would beat up Jews in the streets and do all of these different types of things. And there's a question that many people ask, and that question is an obvious question, and that is, why didn't the Jews leave? Why didn't they leave? In fact, what's even more fascinating is not only did they not leave, but after 1933, many people left, and then there was a return migration where many people came back. In fact, there were so many Jews who had left who were coming back that they created concentration camps where they put the Jews in order to stop the return migration, which was successful, and very few Jews continued returning back because of that. And this is really fascinating, but it's not the first time that we experience the Jewish people being somewhere where it's not working out and they just can't get themselves to leave. And even when they leave, the ones who manage to get themselves to leave, they're coming back. When else did this happen? This happens in this week's Torah portion of Bo, the book of Exodus, right? God performs the 10 plagues. God says to the Jewish people on the night of the 10th plague, at midnight when the firstborns are going to die, that va'atem lo seitzu, you shall not go out of your homes, each man from his home, until the morning. God didn't want them going out in the street. One of the reasons that the Jewish people are put on the strict lockdown was because when the angel of death is out, the angel of death kills indiscriminately. When he sees the homes with the blood on the doorposts, then he will skip over those homes, but everything else he's going to kill. So if you leave those homes, you'll be killed. But there is possibly another reason as well. And the other reason is because God was concerned that the Jewish people may be influenced by their neighbors. By asking, like, where are you going? You're going into the desert? What are you going to do in the desert? How are you going to have food in the desert? Where are you going to get water from in the desert? Like, how's that even going to work out? What type of plan do you have? Right? Now, it's true that the Egyptians were throwing the Jews out, as the Torah tells us that, in fact, what's fascinating is the Jewish people had a hard time leaving. When they actually did leave, the Torah says that the Egyptians had to hurry them to push them out because they had such a hard time leaving Egypt, where they were treated horrifically and entirely enslaved and abused. Fascinating. Not only that, but what were the Jews eating on the night that they left Egypt? What God commanded them to eat: the Paschal lamb. Lamb chops are a good thing. And matzah. That's the first time we hear about matzah, which is why we eat matzah every year on Pesach, on Passover. However, it's not the very first time the Torah mentions matzah. The Torah tells us that Avraham Avinu's nephew Lot, was eating matzah many years earlier, hundreds of years earlier. And that was when the angels came to turn over the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, of Sodom. And they came to save Lot, to take him out. And the Torah says that when Lot brought them into his home, he gave them matzah. Why were they eating matzah? Because it was actually Passover, Pesach. You want to know why they were eating matzah on Passover when Passover didn't even begin yet? Because there was no exodus from Egypt yet. That's because Lot was the nephew of Abraham, of Avraham Avinu, and Abraham was wired spiritually, and therefore he was in touch with the energy of that day, even before that day played itself out with the actual exodus, but that's a different conversation. So he serves them matzah, and eventually they say, no more dallying over here. We're taking you. We have to leave immediately. And they take him and his wife out of the city. And what happens when he and his two daughters? And what happens when he takes them out? The angels tell him, "Do not look back at what is going to happen to Sodom." In other words, you really should be there with them. The fact that you're being saved is in the merit of your uncle, Avraham, you don't have the right to see what's happening to them. And we know, in fact, that Lot's wife did turn back. But here's the thing. We see that Lot also is being told the city is being destroyed. And he has such a hard time leaving that the angel had to force him to leave and tell him that he shouldn't look back, meaning that there's a tendency when someone leaves their home to always want to go back. And when the Jewish people left Egypt, the Torah tells us that God took them, it's in next week's Torah portion of Beshalach, in the circuitous way, not in the direct way. Why? He didn't want to take them derech Eretz Plishtim to where the Philistines lived, because if they would have to confront the Philistines right away, they'd say, let's go back. They wouldn't be able to handle it. So God took them around the Philistines. And even going around the Philistines, they said, let's go back to Egypt. And we know once they were in the desert, numerous times, they said, let's go back to Egypt. They were continuously being pulled to go back to Egypt. The exact same story as what happened in Germany, exact same story that happened in Lot. And to be honest, the exact same story that happens to anyone who has roots in a certain place. It's just very difficult to leave the comforts of one's home. There's something called inertia, right? Or you can say gravity. The strength of inertia is so strong. It's so much easier to stay put than to actually get up and do something. You know, in fact, I was speaking with a personal trainer, and he was telling me that, he was telling me about some guy who was like 85 years old. And I asked this personal trainer, until what age do you plan on training? I'm being a personal trainer. And he said, I think until about 85. I said, wow, 85, you can be able to lift up weights and hand them to other people. That's very impressive. So he said, yeah, as long as one keeps on doing it, you can do that. And he told me about a certain individual who kept, who's 85 years old and was still training people because he himself worked out every single day. Now, why doesn't everyone do that? And I was thinking about this when he was telling this to me. And I know why people don't do that, right? I know why it's so hard for me to do any exercise, because inertia is much stronger. It's much easier to just stay put and not do the hard work. And so it's what will drive us and give us that energy, or for us to awaken within ourselves that energy to do what we know we need to do, even though it's more convenient right now in the immediacy of things to just stay put. So that's the reason why we've seen all of these situations that the Jewish people are always trying to go back. And that's why it's no surprise that the Jewish people stayed in Germany, and then they wanted to go back to Germany. Because here's the thing. Redemption, right? Experiencing redemption means actually the ability to rise above inertia and to do what your belief tells you should be doing, even though convenience tells you otherwise. That is when a person actually experiences expansion in life and freedom. Freedom happens in discomfort. This is very important to know viscerally. Freedom comes in discomfort. It does not come through comfort. Comfort is the danger of inertia. And that's the reason why, when we ask friends for advice, I was just speaking with a good friend of mine. I was asking him for some advice about a situation, and he told me, listen, I don't know if you want to hear this, and he told me whatever he told me. Why was he saying, I don't know if you want to hear this? Because he knew that naturally I'm going to have a resistance to what he was sharing, because it was a little bit unpleasant. And so he said, I don't know if you're going to be able to accept the truth of this, at least the way I see it, he was telling me. But, he's a good friend. I was able to see the truth of what he was saying, right? And because he was a good friend, he told me what he really thought, which gives me openness, access to the truth, if I'm willing to look it in the eye and look things in the situation in the eye as to the way it is. And that is really what a great friend does. A great friend will actually tell you the truth that is uncomfortable. But there's something even greater than that friend, and that is you and I, when we embrace that discomfort and that truth, we actually forge the way forward in the direction that we must go. Because the story that we read about in Egypt is not a story. It's not only a story about Egypt. And primarily today, it's not about Egypt. That's a historical story for us. What happened with Lot is a historical event. What happened even in Germany is historical. The question is, in our very own lives, where we are constrained, but we're comfortable because I know the constrained environment that I'm in. Am I going to stay here, or am I going to actually experience my own exodus from Egypt? And that exodus from Egypt is for me to be open to the idea that there's so much more. There is so much more available and really being demanded of me, which I am responsible to reach out towards. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to make myself uncomfortable, and I'm going to have to entertain the further possibilities that there are. And really, this is what our entire life is about. Because what God did was God took a soul, a divine soul, and he stuck it into a body. And really what he did was he enslaved or imprisoned or constrained the soul in the body. It's deeply constrained by the body, which is very limited as a piece of physical matter. And as we are willing to escape from Egypt, so to speak, to experience an exodus, to break through the limits of our own physical self so that we become more spirit oriented and less physical oriented, till we actually begin to experience that our body limits us less. That is the story of the exodus of Egypt. And that's the reason why the Rambam, Maimonides, and the Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya, every single day one is meant to go out of Egypt. Safe travels.